Spider-Man 4 was surprisingly close to becoming reality. Sam Raimi already had a story, new characters were being cast, and the project was moving forward. But as development continued, the exact same problems that helped derail Spider-Man 3 started happening all over again. And those problems would eventually kill the movie entirely. So what happened? Let's break it all down. When Spider-Man 3 was released in 2007, the reaction from audiences was surprisingly complicated. Financially, the film was a massive success. It became the highest-grossing movie in Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy and generated enormous box office revenue worldwide. But at the same time, many fans felt that the movie was overcrowded. There were too many villains, too many storylines, and too many different ideas competing for attention. Interestingly, Sam Raimi agreed with much of that criticism. Raimi openly admitted that he was never truly satisfied with Spider-Man 3. In fact, he later stated that he failed to make the movie he originally wanted to make. According to Raimi, the direction of the film gradually shifted away from his initial vision. Originally, he wanted the story to focus primarily on Sandman and Vulture. However, Sony Pictures had different ideas. At the time, Venom was one of Marvel's most popular characters, and the studio wanted him included in the film. Gwen Stacy was also added to the story. As a result, Spider-Man 3 eventually became a movie trying to do too many things at once. Looking back, Spider-Man 3 almost feels like two different movies sharing the same screen. Some parts clearly reflect Raimi's storytelling style, especially the emotional conflict between Peter Parker and Sandman. But other parts feel like the studio pushing the franchise to become bigger, louder, and more commercially appealing. Because of that experience, Raimi became even more determined to make a fourth film. He didn't just want to continue the story. He wanted an opportunity to correct the mistakes he felt he had made. As early development on Spider-Man 4 began, Raimi made a very different creative decision. He did not want to repeat the same mistake of cramming the movie with too many villains and too many characters. This time, he wanted a story that was simpler, more focused, and far more personal. The first major villain Raimi chose for Spider-Man 4 was Vulture. At the time, many fans weren't particularly excited about that decision. The reaction became even more negative when rumors surfaced that Adrian Toomes would be played by John Malkovich. Online discussions were filled with skepticism. Some fans felt the character was too old, not exciting enough, and simply not worthy of being the main villain of a Spider-Man movie. But what made Raimi's approach interesting was that he never viewed Vulture as a traditional action villain. His version of Adrian Toomes was reportedly much darker than the comic book counterpart. In this interpretation, Adrian Toomes wasn't just an elderly man wearing mechanical wings. He was a former government contractor who had carried out dirty operations on behalf of the state. According to some story details, he earned the nickname Vulture because after he completed a mission, all that remained of his victims were their bones. Raimi deliberately wanted someone like John Malkovich because he envisioned Toomes as unsettling, strange, and deeply uncomfortable to watch. In many ways, that fit perfectly with the style of villains Raimi had already established. Just look at Willem Dafoe's Green Goblin. He was theatrical, disturbing, and unforgettable. Spider-Man 4 also appeared to be moving in a much more mature direction than the previous films. Peter Parker and Mary Jane's relationship was already damaged after the events of Spider-Man 3. Into that situation came a new character, Felicia Hardy, who was reportedly going to be portrayed by Anne Hathaway. What's particularly interesting is that Raimi never intended for Felicia Hardy to become Black Cat. Instead, this version of the character would have a direct connection to Adrian Toomes. Through that relationship, the story of Spider-Man 4 was beginning to evolve into something much darker and more emotionally painful than previous entries in the franchise. At its core, Spider-Man 4 would have continued the central theme of Raimi's trilogy. Peter Parker struggling to balance his personal life with his responsibilities as Spider-Man. The difference was that this time everything felt heavier. Peter and MJ were reportedly trying to repair their relationship after Spider-Man 3, but the more they tried, the more obvious it became that things would never be the same. During this difficult period, Peter began developing a connection with Felicia Hardy, who worked at the Daily Bugle. This also tied into another major change Raimi wanted to make. In his plans for the film, Adrian Toomes would eventually take control of the Daily Bugle. That meant Peter Parker would unknowingly end up working directly under the film's primary villain. Unlike the comic book version, Felicia Hardy wasn't portrayed as the glamorous cat burglar fans know today. Based on various leaked concepts, her relationship with Peter was intended to feel more realistic and emotionally grounded. Peter gradually developed feelings for her as his relationship with MJ continued to deteriorate. Meanwhile, Adrian Toomes was steadily building his influence throughout New York City. Eventually, the story would culminate in a massive aerial battle between Spider-Man and Vulture high above the city. In one of the most frequently discussed versions of the story, Peter Parker ultimately defeats Adrian Toomes. However, the situation takes a tragic turn when Peter accidentally causes Toomes' death during the fight. The problem is that Felicia witnesses the entire event. Following Adrian Toomes' death, Felicia reportedly assumes her father's identity and transforms into a new villain known as the Vulturess, seeking revenge against Peter Parker. The ending of Spider-Man 4 was also rumored to be far from a traditional happy ending. In some versions of the story, Felicia ultimately defeats Spider-Man, but chooses to spare his life. If that ending had made it to the final film, Spider-Man 4 likely would have served as the beginning of a much darker and more mature era for the franchise, rather than simply concluding Raimi's existing trilogy. Even though Vulture was the main villain, Spider-Man 4 still had several other characters being prepared behind the scenes. One of the most famous examples was Mysterio, who was reportedly set to be portrayed by Bruce Campbell. For longtime fans of Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy, this would have been the payoff to a running joke that had existed since the very first film. Bruce Campbell appeared in all 3 Spider-Man movies. He was the wrestling announcer in the first film, the theater usher in Spider-Man 2, and the restaurant maitre d' in Spider-Man 3. Because of these recurring appearances, many fans developed a theory that every one of those characters was secretly Quentin Beck, a future Mysterio, who had been observing Spider-Man for years. There was also another character Raimi had quietly been building toward for a long time, Dr. Curt Connors. The character had already appeared in Spider-Man 2, played by Dylan Baker, and fans spent years waiting to see him transform into the Lizard. Raimi did have plans for that transformation, but not in Spider-Man 4. Instead, the Lizard was reportedly being saved for Spider-Man 5 because Raimi felt Vulture was a better fit for the 4th film. Even Stan Lee reportedly commented that the Lizard felt like the most logical next step for the franchise. Ironically, after Raimi departed from the project, Sony ended up using the Lizard as the primary villain in The Amazing Spider-Man, directed by Mark Webb and starring Andrew Garfield. The biggest problem was that as Spider-Man 4 moved deeper into development, the situation began to resemble the production of Spider-Man 3 all over again. Raimi remained committed to Vulture as the main villain. Sony, however, started becoming increasingly uncertain about the direction of the project. The negative online reaction to John Malkovich's Vulture certainly didn't help matters. Before long, creative disagreements started emerging once again. According to various reports, Sony was more interested in using the Lizard as the main villain because the character was considered more recognizable, more marketable, and easier to sell to general audiences. Behind the scenes, Sony was also preparing a backup plan. While Raimi continued trying to perfect the script for Spider-Man 4, the studio had already begun discussing the possibility of rebooting the entire franchise. Eventually, Raimi chose to leave the project because he felt he couldn't deliver a film that met his own quality standards within Sony's deadline. Once Raimi stepped away, Sony moved incredibly fast. Only days after Spider-Man 4 was officially canceled, the studio publicly announced its plans for a complete reboot, The Amazing Spider-Man. And just like that, the era of Sam Raimi's Spider-Man came to an end. But here's the question. If Spider-Man 4 had actually been made, would the history of modern Spider-Man movies look completely different today? What do you think? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.